The stars outside the small escape pod blinked like dying candles. Inside, Rick gripped the controls with sweaty hands. Trying to steady the spinning pod, his ship had been hit during a meteor storm, and now he was falling fast toward an unknown. Planet red lights flashed and alarms screamed, but nothing he did could stop the crash. The pod broke through the planet's thick clouds and slammed into the dense jungle below. When Rick opened his eyes, everything was silent, except for the slow hiss of smoke and the soft crackling of fire. He was alive, but barely. His head throbbed, and his suit had a long tear down the leg. He reached for his emergency kit and crawled. Out of the broken pod around him stood massive trees, their trunks thicker than houses. Their leaves glowing faintly green, the air was thick and humid. Filled with buzzing sounds from unseen creatures, he tried to use his communicator. But there was no signal, not even static. "Great," Rick muttered. "No backup, no help." He checked the planet's atmosphere with a handheld scanner. Breathable, but strange, the scanner kept giving weak energy readings from deeper in the jungle. He decided to move before nightfall, even though every direction looked dangerous, as he pushed through giant vines and thorny bushes. He noticed strange symbols carved into some trees, not natural. Someone or something lived here. Rick's heart pounded, and he kept his stun blaster close. Then, suddenly, the ground shook. It was faint at first, like a distant drumbeat, then stronger, rhythmic, heavy. Boom, boom, boom. Boom. Rick ducked behind a fallen log just as something emerged from the shadows. It was enormous, at least 25 feet tall. A towering female figure with strong limbs, deep gray-blue skin, and bright glowing red eyes. She moved with power and grace, her long dark hair swinging like a cloak behind her. Rick's breath caught in his throat. She was not just big, she was terrifying. Her teeth, sharp and white, were slightly bared. As she sniffed the air, Rick tried to stay silent, but a snapped twig betrayed his hiding spot. The giantess turned her head sharply. Her eyes locking directly onto his, she stepped forward slowly, one massive foot thudding against the ground. Rick raised his blaster with trembling hands. But he knew it wouldn't help. She could crush him with one step. "Please don't eat me," he whispered to himself. To his surprise, she didn't attack. She tilted her head, studying him like a curious animal. Then, with surprising speed, she reached down and plucked him from the ground. Rick shouted in fear, kicking his legs, but she didn't squeeze or harm him. Instead, she brought him close to her face and sniffed him again. A low growl rumbled in her chest, but her eyes looked thoughtful. Rick's mind raced. Was she deciding whether he was food or something else? She opened her mouth slightly, enough for him to see her fangs. His heart nearly stopped. Then, just as he braced for death, she closed her mouth again and gave a soft huff. It almost sounded like disappointment. Without warning, she turned and began walking deeper into the jungle. Still holding Rick like a toy, he shouted, struggled, even tried to bite her hand, but she ignored him. Her grip was firm, but careful. Like she didn't want to hurt him, only take him somewhere after a while. The thick trees opened into a wide clearing. In the middle stood what looked like a large nest made of glowing vines and smooth stones. Strange alien lights pulsed from the ground, casting soft blue shadows. The giantess placed Rick gently onto a soft patch of moss. Then she sat beside him, watching him quietly. She didn't speak, but her eyes said everything. She was not just some wild beast. She had intelligence, emotion, maybe even pain hidden. Behind her strength, Rick sat frozen, his blaster long forgotten. He had crashed into a nightmare. But now, inside this silent jungle with a giant alien woman watching him, he wasn't so sure. Was she a monster? A captor? Or something far more complicated? Whatever the answer, Rick knew one thing for sure. His life had just taken a turn he never saw coming. Rick didn't sleep that night. He lay on the soft moss inside the giantess's lair, staring at the vines glowing above him. She sat nearby, unmoving, like a silent mountain made of muscle and mystery. Her red eyes glowed faintly in the dark. Watching him with unreadable emotion, Rick kept thinking, why didn't she eat me? Why am I still alive? No answers came, only the sound of insects outside and the slow rumble of her breathing. When the morning light filtered through the treetops, she finally moved. With the gentleness of someone handling something fragile, she picked him up again. Rick didn't struggle this time. He just stared into her giant face, hoping for a sign. She gave none. Only turned and walked into the jungle, carrying him like a treasure. The jungle was alive with color and sound. Birds with crystal wings flew overhead, and small creatures with many eyes scurried under the leaves. Rick felt like a toy in the arms of a titan. Helpless but strangely safe, she stopped near a waterfall and gently set him down on a flat stone without speaking. She pulled fruit from a tall plant and broke it open. She held it out to him. Rick hesitated. She didn't force him, only waited. Finally, Rick took a bite. It was sweet, with a strange aftertaste, but he was too hungry to care. As he ate, she sat across from him, still and calm. The wind blew her long dark hair behind her like a cape. She tilted her head when he spoke, trying to mimic his sounds. "Rick," he said, tapping his chest. She blinked, then pointed at him and said, "Rook, close enough." He pointed at her, unsure if it was safe to ask. She looked confused, then tapped her own chest and said softly, "Gara." Rick nodded. "Gara," he repeated. A small smile touched her lips, barely there, but real. They returned to her lair by sunset. Rick noticed strange items around the nest, carved stones, woven nets, even a broken piece of metal that looked like human tech. Had she found parts of other crash sites? Other humans? He didn't ask. He couldn't. But a cold feeling settled in his gut that night. She gave him a blanket made of soft leaves and plant fiber. Rick wrapped himself in it. His body warm, but his mind spinning. She lay down a few feet away, curled into a massive shape like a sleeping panther. Rick whispered into the air, "What are you, Gara?" He didn't expect an answer, but her eyes opened in the dark. She stared at him silently, then pointed to the stars through the vines above. Her fingers slowly lowered to her own chest. She whispered one word he didn't understand, but her tone was sad. Rick had no idea what it meant, but in that moment, he understood her. She was alone. Just like him, the next morning Rick tried to explore the clearing a bit more. He walked around the edges, testing his limits. Gara followed it. A distance, not stopping him, but always watching, he found a small stream, clear and cold. With fish that glowed when they swam, he smiled for the first time in days. Beautiful, he whispered. Gara appeared behind him, looked at the stream, then looked at him. "Beautiful," she echoed slowly, copying his tone. Rick laughed. Not because it was funny, but because it felt human. Gara's eyes sparkled like she was proud of herself later. She brought him a gift, a wooden bowl filled with strange glowing berries. He accepted them carefully, trying to show respect. She sat beside him and watched as he ate. He offered one back to her, and after a moment's hesitation, she took it and ate it. They shared a simple moment. No fear, no struggle, just quiet understanding. But Rick couldn't forget the earlier carvings in the trees, and the broken tech, and the fact that she kept looking at him like he was more than just a visitor. He remembered the way she studied him, not with hunger, but with intention, as if she had a purpose, a plan, that night, as he drifted to sleep. Gara began to hum, a deep melodic sound that echoed through the trees like wind. Rick closed his eyes, listening. The melody was sad and full of longing. As he faded into sleep, one thought kept whispering in his mind. He hadn't been captured. He had been chosen. Rick had stopped thinking of her as a monster, not because he trusted her, but because monsters didn't hum lullabies at night. Monsters didn't offer food, mimic words, or build moss beds for their captives. Still, fear clung to the corners of his thoughts. Even when she smiled, he couldn't forget how sharp her teeth were. Gara was unpredictable one moment. Was gently feeding him pieces of fruit. The next, she was leaping through the trees like a beast chasing invisible ghosts. Rick watched her from the safety of the clearing. Amazed and confused, she was wild, powerful, but strangely aware of him every time she returned. Her red eyes searched for him first. Every time he stumbled or fell, her huge hands caught him before he hit the ground. Days passed, but time felt broken in the jungle. The sky never stayed one color for long. Glowing insects buzzed in the air. Like floating stars, Rick began keeping track by carving marks into a smooth stone near the nest. Day 7, or maybe 8, brought something new. Gra returned carrying the skeleton of a large beast. Her body covered in dark green blood and deep scratches. Rick froze when she approached.
Oh.
Her body shaking slightly, she knelt in front of him and dropped the bones with a heavy thud. Then she looked up at him with eyes that weren't proud. They were scared. Rick hesitated, then slowly walked to her. He placed a hand on her arm. His entire hand barely touched her massive skin, but she closed her eyes, exhaled deeply, and let herself fall back against a tree. That night, Rick couldn't sleep. The memory of her battle, her injuries, and her silence haunted him. He stepped away from the nest and wandered to the edge of the forest clearing. There, half hidden by hanging vines, he found a cave entrance inside. Strange carvings covered the walls, ancient symbols and figures, giant women drawn in a circle with flames around them. In the center of the drawings was a much smaller figure, a human-like shape. Rick stared at it, heart racing. Had other humans been here before him? Or had Gara known about humans all along? He turned to leave, but found her blocking the cave entrance. Her face was unreadable, but her eyes glowed softly. She stepped forward and touched one of the carvings with her finger, then pointed at herself. Then at Rick. Then she pointed to the sky. Rick understood one thing. This was not random. She had chosen him for a reason. But what reason? The next morning, Gara brought him a gift. It wasn't food this time, but a necklace made of carved bones and glowing stones. She carefully placed it around his neck. Her fingers gentle, despite their size. Rick felt the weight of it not just the physical weight, but something deeper, like he had been marked. That day they didn't speak, not even in broken words. Instead, Gara showed him how she hunted, how she moved without sound, how she tracked with scent. She showed him plants that healed and others that burned. Rick followed her, watching every movement, trying to understand the way she saw the world. For a moment, he forgot fear, forgot escape. For a moment, it felt like learning from someone ancient. Later, while they shared a meal, Rick spoke. "Why me, Gara?" he asked softly. She looked at him, touched the necklace on his chest, and whispered a word he didn't know. Then she repeated it. Slower this time, it sounded like Belra. Rick repeated it, Belra. She nodded once, then pointed at the stars again, then back to him. He didn't understand, but somehow, he felt her answer was not about survival. It was about something older, deeper, maybe even sacred that night. Rick dreamed of giant women standing in a circle. He stood in the center, wearing the same necklace. They chanted something in a language he didn't know, but Gara was there, smiling softly when he woke up. She was sitting beside him, watching, and for the first time Rick didn't feel like a prisoner. He felt like he was part of something. Maybe not yet understood, but real. Was she a monster? No, not anymore. Maybe she was something even more dangerous. A mother without children, a protector without a tribe, a giantess who had chosen a human to fill the hole left in her world. And maybe, just maybe, Rick didn't want to leave anymore. The jungle changed that day. It wasn't just the trees or the strange sky. It was the way Gara moved. She was tense, her steps sharper, her eyes scanning the treetops like something hunted her. Rick noticed it first when she woke him before sunrise. No hums, no smile. Just a deep growl and a finger pressed to her lips. She picked him up and carried him through the forest. Faster than ever before, they didn't stop to eat or drink. Rick clung to her shoulder as leaves whipped past them and shadows moved just out of sight. Something was following them, something big. Gara didn't speak, but her eyes showed fear. They reached a stone path, ancient and broken, almost hidden. Beneath the vines, Gara slowed down and sniffed the air. Rick looked around and saw large stone heads buried in the ground, faces like Gara's. But cracked and forgotten, he whispered, "What is this place?" Gara said nothing, only pointed forward. Rick saw it then. A city, or what was left of one, Massive stone towers leaned against trees, their tops broken and covered in moss. Statues of giant women lined the roads, most missing arms or heads. There were symbols carved everywhere, some Rick had seen in the cave. Others were new, sharper, angry-looking. They walked deeper into the ruins until they reached a large platform. At its center was a circle of fire pits, long cold, surrounded by stone seats big enough for giants. Gara knelt and touched the ground. She whispered something Rick couldn't understand, her voice shaking, suddenly. A deep roar echoed through the trees. Rick jumped as Gara stood quickly, grabbing a large branch like a weapon from the jungle. 3 giant shapes appeared, taller than Gara, wearing bone armor and glowing war paint. They surrounded the platform, their eyes locked on Rick. One of them snarled and raised a spear. Gara stepped between Rick and the others. Baring her teeth and roaring louder than Rick had ever heard, the other giants hesitated, shocked by her defiance. Then they spoke in the same tongue, harsh, fast, filled with rage. Rick couldn't understand the words, but he understood the intent. They wanted him not to kill, but to take. Gara growled something back, and the ground seemed to tremble. The tallest one pointed at Rick and shouted the word, Belra. Rick froze, remembering the dream, the carvings, the necklace. Whatever Belra meant, it was him, and it mattered to them. The giants argued with Gara, their voices rising like thunder. Rick could only watch as his protector stood firm. Finally, one of the giants threw down his spear in disgust and turned away. The others followed, disappearing into the trees. Gara's body relaxed, but her face showed pain. Not victory. That night they camped near a stone bridge with broken chains hanging. From its sides, Gara didn't eat, didn't sleep. She sat in silence. Staring at the necklace around Rick's neck, he stepped closer and placed a hand on her arm. She looked at him, eyes glowing with sadness. He whispered, "They were your tribe, weren't they?" She didn't answer in words. She only nodded once, slowly. Rick sat beside her, his heart heavy. The other giants had wanted him not out of hate but tradition. Whatever the role of Belra was, it had meaning to them, to their past. And Gara had broken that tradition to protect him. He realized then she was more than the last of her kind. She was a rebel, a guardian of something she could no longer explain. And now she had chosen Rick over the laws of her people before sleep took him. Rick looked at the ancient carvings again, the small figure in the center of the giants, not a prisoner, not a victim, but a key, a bridge between worlds, and he understood. He wasn't just part of her story. He was the story. Rick awoke to the sound of soft rain falling on stone. He opened his eyes and saw Gara sitting at the edge of the broken bridge. Staring into the mist below, she didn't move when he approached. She just sat there. Silent, her back straight, her expression unreadable. Rick sat beside her, feeling the weight of the night before, the other giants, the word Belra. The look in her eyes when she stood between him and her own kind. He had so many questions but no language to ask them in. Gara finally turned to him and pointed. "At his chest, Belra," she said softly. Rick nodded. "You keep saying that," he whispered. "What does it mean?" She tapped her heart. "Then his Belra," she repeated. Her voice was filled with sorrow and hope. Rick tried to understand. She wasn't calling him a name. She was calling him something important, a role, a purpose, a bond. But what? Kind? Later, Gara took him to a quiet part of the jungle. There, she pulled away thick vines and revealed a stone door. Half buried in the earth, together, they cleared the entrance. Behind it lay a forgotten chamber, cold and still, carvings covered every wall. Lit by natural light that came through cracks in the ceiling, Rick stepped inside and stared, stunned. The pictures showed humans, not just one, but many. Some stood beside giantesses, others sat on thrones carved from bone and stone. At the center of it all was a large figure wearing a crown made of glowing vines. Round his neck was a necklace just like Rick's. He turned to Gara, eyes wide. This already happened?" Gara nodded. Her fingers traced the carvings as if remembering a dream. Rick began to understand. Long ago, Humans and giantesses were allies, maybe even bonded, but something had shattered that world. Now only Gara remained, holding on to the pieces. She pointed at one wall, where a battle was carved. Giants fighting other giants, cities burning, humans vanishing. Rick whispered, "A war." Gara nodded again, her face tight with pain. Whatever happened had destroyed more than just stone. It had destroyed trust. They sat in the silent chamber for a long time. Rick ran his hand over the stone, feeling the history pressed into its surface. He wasn't the first human to be here, but he might be the last. Later, back in the clearing, Rick taught Gara more words. He pointed to the sky. Stars. He pointed to himself. Human. She smiled and repeated the words. Slowly, carefully, when he said friend and touched her arm, she looked at him with wide eyes. Then she touched his hand gently and whispered Belra, not with confusion, but with understanding. Over the next few days, they grew closer. They shared meals, explored ruins, laughed, and sometimes sat in silence, just breathing the same air. Gara began to speak more. Even in her broken way, Rick learned that Belra meant chosen companion or heart bond. It was a sacred role in the old times, a bond between human and giantess that brought peace and power. But it was also dangerous because it could break old laws and invite the wrath of those who still lived by them. One evening, as they sat beside a quiet stream, Rick noticed something strange. His hands had small cuts, but they weren't healing properly. His breath felt shorter, his skin colder. The jungle or something in the planet was slowly poisoning him. His body wasn't made for this world. He was fading. Gara saw it too. She sniffed his skin, checked his pulse with her giant fingers, and let out a deep, trembling sound without a word. She picked him up and started running, not toward the nest, not toward the city, but deeper, into the jungle. Faster than ever before, her eyes wild with fear, Rick tried to speak, to ask where they were going, but she didn't answer. She just ran, leaping over rivers, dodging trees, her hair flying behind her like a banner. Hours passed, or maybe only minutes, Rick couldn't tell. Finally, they reached a clearing where a crashed alien ship lay half buried in vines and mud. Gara growled as she pulled the door open with brute force. Inside, it was dark and cold, filled with dust and old tech. Rick felt himself slipping away, the edges of the world growing dim. Gara placed him on a table, grabbed a glowing container, and injected him with something silver. Pain surged through him, then silence. When Rick opened his eyes, he was alive, barely but alive, and Gara was sitting beside him, holding his hand, her giant fingers trembling. For the first time, she looked small, not in size but in spirit. Like she had almost lost everything. Rick squeezed her hand and whispered one word, Belra, asterisk. Rick's eyes fluttered open to soft green light blinking above him. He blinked twice, chest rising in shaky breaths. Something sharp had been pulled. From inside him, the poison, maybe his body still ached, but he was alive. The air smelled like dust and metal, old and forgotten. He tried to sit up, but his limbs were weak. Then he felt a warm, steady hand against his back, large, careful, trembling. It was Gara. She had stayed at his side through the night. Her eyes were red-rimmed, her face hollow like she hadn't slept at all. Rick looked around and realized he was inside a medbay. The alien ship was barely intact. Half its walls broken, its systems flickering. Gara must have torn it open with her bare hands just to get him inside. She had saved his life again. He touched her arm gently and whispered, "Thank you." Gara didn't speak. She only looked at him like he was more fragile than before, more breakable, more important, after resting for some hours. Rick managed to stand. He walked carefully around the broken room, seeing old screens, shattered equipment, and dried blood on the floor. This ship had crashed long ago, maybe years. It was a ghost of something terrible. But somehow, in that ruin, Gara had found hope. Rick sat on a nearby bench, staring at the necklace around his neck. He remembered the carvings, the history, the dreams. Belra, he whispered, I think I understand now. He wasn't just a survivor. He was her bond, her anchor. The last piece of a story long buried in stone. Suddenly alarms echoed through the ship, loud and sharp. Rick stood up quickly, confused. Gara growled and moved to the ship's entrance. Her eyes narrowed. Rick followed her outside and stopped cold. Across the jungle clearing, 3 more giant figures had arrived. They were warriors, massive, armored, and armed with jagged blades made of bone and light. Their war paint glowed bright red, and their faces were twisted with rage. They had found Gara, and they had come for him. Rick stepped back, but Gara didn't. She stepped forward instead, placing herself between Rick and the others. One of them roared and slammed a blade against the ground. The sound shook the trees. Rick could feel the hatred pouring off them like heat. They shouted in their ancient tongue, and Rick recognized one word clearly: Belra. They didn't want to kill him. They wanted to take him, to use him for some old ritual, some tradition that Gara had broken. But Gara refused to move. She stood tall, her arms out, her voice low but firm. Rick didn't understand the words. She spoke, but the message was clear. He's mine. The largest warrior snarled and charged. Gara met him halfway with a thunderous cry. The ground exploded as their massive bodies collided. The other 2 joined, turning the peaceful clearing into a battleground. Rick could do nothing but watch. Heart pounding, Gara fought with wild power. But she was outnumbered. Her strength was great, but the warriors were brutal. They struck her again and again, until her body began to slow. Blood dripped from her shoulder, one eye swollen shut. Still, she stood between them and Rick. Still, she fought. Rick searched the ship desperately. He found a control panel sparking with unstable energy. A small button blinked with alien symbols beside the words Power Core Override. Rick hesitated only a second, then he slammed his hand down on it. Sharp hum filled the air from the base of the ship. Act! Glowing lines began to crawl outward, bright and fast. The warriors froze, sensing the danger too late. Gara looked back at Rick, eyes wide. He shouted, "Get away from the ship. Run." But she didn't run. Instead, she turned and charged the remaining warriors. She grabbed 2 of them in a crushing embrace and dragged them toward the burning core. Rick screamed her name, but she only looked back once, her face calm, her eyes soft. She mouthed the word Belra, and then light, heat, silence. Rick woke up hours later under a blanket of ash and glowing leaves. The clearing was destroyed, the ship gone. The warriors turned to shadows, and Gara gone. He called her name until his voice broke. But there was no answer. Only the memory of her hand, her hum, her protection. Her sacrifice. Rick stood there, shaking, the necklace still glowing faintly against his chest. She had saved him again, not with kindness, but with her life. And now he was alone again, but not the same. Days had passed, but Rick couldn't tell how many. The jungle no longer felt alive. It felt hollow, quiet. The sounds of strange birds and glowing insects were still there, but without Gara. The world felt like it had lost its color. He walked, alone through the jungle, the trees towering over him. The ash from the ship still covered parts of the ground. Every broken branch reminded him of the battle. Every footprint reminded him of the one who was no longer beside him. He wore the bone necklace every day, not just because she gave it to him, but because it was the only piece of her he had left. Sometimes at night he thought he heard her hum, the same melody she used to sing while watching over him, but when he opened his eyes, there was only wind through the leaves. Rick had no plan now. He wandered, surviving on the things Gara had taught him. Which plants to eat, which paths to avoid, how to listen to the jungle's rhythm. Everything she gave him was now part of him. Her lessons, her protection, her presence. They had become his guide. Then one morning, while walking near a high cliff overlooking the valley, he saw something far in the distance. Above the trees, a moving shadow, too large to be a beast. He climbed the ridge, heart racing, eyes searching. And then he saw her, Gara, standing at the edge of a cliff far across the jungle. Her body bruised, her left arm wrapped in vines. But she was alive, tall, proud, watching the stars. Rick's heart leaped. He shouted her name, waving his arms, but he was too far. The wind carried his voice. But she didn't turn. Instead, she placed one hand gently on her chest. Right over her heart, Rick stopped, breath caught in his throat. It was the gesture she had learned from him. The way he had once said heart, the way he had shown her what Belra meant. She stood there for a long moment, then slowly stepped back into the jungle. The vines closed behind her, and she was gone again. But not like before. This time she chose it. This time it wasn't an end. It was a beginning. Rick didn't cry. He simply sat down on the ridge, watching the trees sway in the wind. He knew she wouldn't come back. Not now, maybe not ever. But she was alive. And somewhere in that endless green world, she was still watching the stars. Later, Rick was found by a rescue team, a human scouting ship that picked up the faint emergency beacon he had triggered days ago. They pulled him from the jungle like a ghost, surprised he was even alive. He didn't tell them everything. Only that he had survived a crash and hid in the forest until they arrived.
Ow.
No one would believe the truth anyway. A giantess who saved a human, protected him, bonded with him, a forgotten tribe, sacred bond, a living myth. They'd laugh, or worse, come looking for her. So Rick said nothing. But when he returned to the space station orbiting above that green world, he requested a window-facing room every night. He sat there, looking down at the planet. Sometimes he'd whisper her name. Sometimes he'd close his eyes and remember her hand around him, holding him like he mattered. And always he wore the necklace tucked under his shirt, close to his heart. Scientists later declared the planet unfit for colonization, to unstable. Too wild, the jungle was left alone, unspoiled. But Rick knew the truth. It wasn't wild. It was sacred. He was never the same again. He didn't crave cities or crowds. He didn't care for medals or interviews, because in his heart, he had already found what most people spend lifetimes searching for. Someone who saw him. Someone who chose him. Someone who would fight the world to protect him. And somewhere in the thick green trees of that forgotten planet, a giantess still walked beneath the stars, humming a melody only two hearts in the galaxy truly remembered.